Welcome back to the deep dive. We take the big stacks of sources, you get the high-speed download. Today, we are strapping into a time machine. Destination, America, between 1865 and 1898. We're talking about incredible industrial transformation, the Gilded Age. And our mission, really, is to decode how this happened. How did technology, all those resources and government policies kind of combine to completely reshape the U.S. economy?
And fuel this.
Well, the sources keep calling it an unprecedented acceleration in industrial output.
It really was an acceleration, yeah. But maybe more than that, it was a total re-engineering of the structure. I mean, you're looking at the U.S. shifting from, well, mainly farming and small local workshops to this powerhouse of mechanized manufacturing, serving the whole nation and starting to look overseas, too. So if you want to get the foundations, the actual DNA of modern American industry, this is the period where it all came together.
Okay, let's unpack that shift then. Looking at the sources, there's a pretty clear starting point for this re-engineering. It seems to be the railroad. Feels like nothing else really moves without it. First, the numbers are just, wow. After the Civil War, railroad mileage jumped fivefold.
Fivefold. Incredible.
Yeah, and this wasn't just, adding a few tracks here and there. This was like building a nervous system for the whole country. Yeah. By 1900, you have 4 transcontinental railroads finally linking up these regional economies that had basically been operating on their own for generations.
And that speed, that scale, it was completely transformative. Suddenly you have fast, reliable transport. And that's the absolute basic requirement for mass production, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't make tons of stuff cheaply in one spot if you can't ship it quickly and reliably to people thousands of miles away. So the railroads, they just sort of dissolved those physical barriers. They created a truly national market almost overnight. And that made the huge investments in factories actually seem like a good bet. But hang on a sec. While the railroad tech was crucial, I agree. Doesn't the scale of government help suggest policy was maybe the real enabler here? I mean, the sources really stress this wasn't just private companies doing their thing.
That's a really good point. Yeah, the sources are crystal clear on that. Government support was essential for kind of de-risking it all. Federal policies were actively pushing construction. Huge land grants, loan subsidies. I mean, get this. The government granted over 170 million acres to railroad companies.
Wow. That's vast.
It is.
Yeah.
And that let the private companies raise the money they needed to lay track across these incredibly remote areas because the land itself and the promise of future business, that was the collateral. That was the incentive. So it was really the government making that first enormous bet with the land that unlocked all the private money needed to actually build the lines.
Exactly. That's the crucial context, isn't it? Policy created the conditions for the technology to really take off at scale. Okay, so the railroads built the highways, so to speak. Now, what about the stuff moving on those highways, the materials, the fuel?
Absolutely. And the U.S. was, well, incredibly lucky there, sitting on mountains of coal, iron ore, oil, timber, all the essentials. Which brings us to the whole logistics of getting raw materials to the factories. You had these key spots like the anthracite coal fields in western Pennsylvania. That was the main energy source early on. And then the huge Mesabi Range iron ore deposits up in Minnesota.
Right, way up there.
Exactly. And the distance between the coal, the iron ore, and the factories was immense. It was only because the railroads were reliable that Minnesota's iron ore even became a viable industrial resource.
And that leads us straight to the defining material of this whole era.
Steel.
The Bessemer process. That was the breakthrough technology that literally reshaped America.
How so exactly? I know it made steel better, cheaper.
Well, before Bessemer, making steel was slow, it was expensive. You only really used it for things like special tools. But the Bessemer method, basically blasting air through molten iron to burn off the junk quickly, it didn't just make stronger steel, it made massive amounts of it, and way, way cheaper. That's your classic economy of scale right there.
Okay, so cheap, strong steel. Why is that such a big deal beyond just being, a better material?
Because it allowed for entirely new styles of building. It meant heavier, safer railroad tracks and bigger train cars.
Ah, right.
It meant you could build massive bridges spanning huge rivers. And crucially, it gave you the framework for skyscrapers. Those tall buildings started changing the look of cities completely.
So it transformed transportation and how we built cities basically at the same time.
Exactly, simultaneously.
And while steel was building the structures, the energy source was also shifting, wasn't it? Coal was king early on, but the sources show petroleum starting to take over later, especially as machines got more complex and eventually, engines.
Yep, the energy story evolves too.
Okay, so we've connected the country with rails. We're building big with cheap steel. But managing all this coast-to-coast industrial machine must have been incredibly complex. We need to talk about shrinking distance with information speed.
That complexity point is perfect.
Yeah.
Think about it. A factory owner in Pittsburgh. Suddenly, they've got suppliers maybe in Minnesota, customers out in San Francisco. You just couldn't run that kind of operation effectively using the mail. It was too slow.
Right. Weeks for communication.
Exactly. So that's why the telegraph spreading everywhere and then getting that cable across the Atlantic, that was revolutionary for business. Suddenly you could communicate almost instantly, manage inventory, react to prices, make international deals in minutes, not weeks.
This compressed time.
Totally compressed time. Managers could be way more nimble, react to the market much faster.
And then even faster communication arrived. Alexander Graham Bell, 1876, the telephone. And the really fascinating thing here is how quickly it caught on. Think about this. By 1880, just 4 years later, around 50,000 phones were already in use.
That is fast adoption for that time.
Staggering, right?
Yeah.
It just shows how much businesses needed that instant personal connection, especially in those booming cities.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the early days of mobile phones for us. You immediately saw how useful it was for getting things done efficiently.
True. But the ultimate game changer, the thing that really rewrote the physical rules for industry, that was electrification. We often talk about Edison and the light bulb, which was huge, obviously.
Okay.
But it was the spread of electric power networks that truly revolutionized things.
How so? What was the big impact there?
Well, before electricity, factories were basically tied to daylight hours, or they used expensive, kind of dim, and sometimes dangerous gas lighting.
Okay.
Reliable, cheap electric power, that just blew those limits away. It meant factories could run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if they wanted.
Yeah, the nonstop factory.
Exactly. That shift to continuous operation, it completely changed production capacity. It changed the whole relationship between workers and the clock, between labor and output.
That focus on continuous feels vital. That's how output just exploded. And profits too, presumably.
Absolutely.
And this acceleration, it was happening everywhere. Even in something as basic as feeding all the people flocking to the cities for those factory jobs. I mean, the cities were swelling. The demand for food was immense.
Yeah.
So industry had to innovate food production, just like it innovated steel.
Right.
You see huge steps forward in canning, in refrigeration technology, mechanized processing, things that made food last longer and easier to ship.
And the meatpacking industry example is just a masterclass in supply chain thinking for the time. You had companies like Swift and Armour. They centralized the whole messy business of slaughtering and packing in places like Chicago.
Dockyards.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then they used refrigerated rail cars, which were a major tech innovation themselves, to ship the finished meat, not the live animals, all across the country.
So much more efficient.
Way more efficient. And it wasn't just efficiency. It created what we'd call an economy of scope. It meant fresh meat was available pretty much year-round everywhere, which totally changed diet standards of living. And it lowered costs because of that centralization and the sheer scale of the processing.
So you put it all together. Efficient railroads, cutting-edge tech like steel and electricity, tons of labor coming in.
Yeah, from farms and from overseas.
And access to huge amounts of investment money. It really was like the perfect storm for industrial growth.
It was.
But that sheer scale, that velocity, it eventually started changing the companies themselves, didn't it? How did all this capacity reshape the structure of American business?
It absolutely did. It led to these new massive organizations, structures designed specifically to manage and maximize those economies of scale you just mentioned. Think about it. Higher efficiency drove prices way down, which is great for consumers. But it also meant you needed enormous amounts of money up front to build those giant, efficient factories. So to get that money and then grab as much market share as possible, companies started integrating vertically. Very quickly.
Okay, vertical integration. What did that look like in practice? Andrew Carnegie, maybe?
Carnegie's the classic example, yeah.
Yeah.
Vertical integration for him meant controlling everything. Owning the iron ore mines up in Mesabi, owning the coal fields for fuel, owning the ships and the railroads to move it all, owning the steel mills themselves, and even controlling the sales network.
Wow. From ground to buyer.
Exactly. That gave companies like his incredible efficiency and tight control over their costs, made it very hard for smaller players to compete.
And this leads right into those defining terms of the era, corporations and trusts. For listeners, what exactly was a trust back then in the 1890s?
Well, a trust was basically a tool for consolidation, a mechanism. You'd have stockholders from a bunch of different supposedly competing companies
Hmm.
turn over their shares, their voting rights, to a central group of trustees. And those trustees would then manage all those formally separate companies as if they were one single giant enterprise.
Okay, so cooling control.
Precisely. And the goal was pretty straightforward. Maximize those economies of scale even further, eliminate messy competition, and stabilize, or let's be honest, control prices across an entire industry, whether it was oil, sugar, tobacco, steel, you name it. And these trusts, they fundamentally reshaped how the American economy worked. They laid down the tracks for the kind of centralized industrial capitalism we still see aspects of today.
That really does pull it all together, doesn't it? Looking back at this whole period, 1865 to 1898, the key ingredient seems so clear now. Technology, resources, and just sheer speed. Speed of transport, speed of communication, speed of nonstop production.
Indeed. It was the convergence. All those things coming together, kicked off, and supported by that crucial government policy we talked about. That's what let the U.S. transform from this collection of mostly separate regions into a genuine industrial giant, basically within a single generation. It was astonishingly fast.
So here's something to think about as you go about your day. That combination, the centralized production in huge factories, the 24/7 continuous operation, the relentless drive for scale, it fundamentally altered the relationship between big money, the workforce, and the government itself. Those early consolidations, the trusts, those giant corporations, they weren't just setting prices for steel or oil. They were defining economic power. Maybe consider how much of the debates we have today about monopolies, market control, the sheer size and influence of companies are really just echoes, new versions maybe, of the battles people like Carnegie and Rockefeller started right here, back in the Gilded Age. Thanks for diving in with us. We'll catch you on the next Dean Dive.